Android Dialogues, where we have bite-sized conversations with people in the Android community. I'm Huyen, and I'm speaking with
Dave Smith.
Hi Dave, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. We are currently in Denver, Colorado-ish, and Dave has very generously donated his time and office to be with us. So Dave, how did you get started in Android?
Well, it was kind of a wild hair, actually. My background is in electrical engineering, and I used to work in embedded systems, a lot in M2M type applications, things that we now call IoT, but we had different names for them back then. Mm-hmm. And you know, one day I just decided that this stuff going on with mobile app stores and iOS and Android, it looked really interesting, looked really fun. I had done a little bit of programming in college beyond just the embedded system stuff that I did, and I thought, you know what the heck, I'm going to give it a try. So I quit my job, started doing consulting, and just kind of taught myself as I went along, and and then I was doing a lot of iOS and Android together early on, and then I learned that I favored Android. I really liked the architecture of the platform, and I also knew Java a little bit better than Objective-C at the time, so I started moving that direction, and here we are now.
Oh, awesome. So what do you do currently?
So right now I work for Circle, which is a training organization. We do training in all open source technologies, and Android just happens to be a part of that. So I'm responsible for all of the Android courseware, building new courses, keeping old courses up to date, and teaching courses as well, trying to help Android developers get better at what they do.
Oh, awesome. So I guess I'm really excited to talk to Dave because because I feel like Dave, like if anybody like I've ever like watched like your the talks of and stuff like that, I feel like Dave is like an expert at becoming an expert at things. So like in the last like say 6 months, you've done talks on Bluetooth and beacons. Is that right? You did a talk on kind of like the Android startup stuff, so all the internals and how your phone actually gets into Android.
Correct.
Like, right. And you talked about RecyclerView and like how to do your own layout managers. And so I guess like there's like a ton of questions I could ask you each on like those specific things. But like in general, like if I'm like a brand new person and I wanted to get started in Android, what would be like your kind of like top 3 or something tips on what is it like where should I go for like getting started with Android?
Sure. Learn the documentation.
Okay.
You know, that may sound a little bit trite, but Android documentation is really quite good, and they've done a great job both in the videos they produce as well as the training guides that they've written. Just getting started with their stuff is, in my opinion, fairly easy to do. It definitely gets you going with the basics, learning the tools, and that sort of thing. The biggest thing that I would say after you've kind of gotten your feet wet in it, that I think even a lot of experienced Android developers don't do enough, is figure out how to get into the source code. Android is open source, and it's very easy to, you don't even have to have your own copy of the source code. You can just go to different web browsers and pull that down or just take a look at it. And there's so much you can learn from just looking at the source. You know, even if it's just because you're looking at different things that they didn't necessarily document intentionally, their internal behaviors, but you want to learn about how something works. Or sometimes documentation is not right.
Oh, really?
You know, documentation is not perfect. Either people forget things, or the behavior changes and the documentation isn't up to date, but the code can never lie. So if you can figure out a way to learn how to navigate the source code, specifically as an app developer, the source code of the framework. But if you can get yourself into that source code and get yourself familiar with how to move around in there, then not only can you learn a lot about how they did things and how you might want to copy those behaviors in your application, but you can, if you're running into a problem and it just doesn't make sense based on what the documentation is saying, look at the way the code is implemented and you go, oh, it's because they flipped that bit in the wrong order or in the order I didn't expect. And that behavior will be very much enlightening to you.
Oh, I really like the code doesn't lie. I really, really like that. Actually, isn't there like, I think there's like a Chrome plugin or something where if you go to like the actual developer.android.com, the documentation, I think it'll actually pop up a link. Like it'll actually like add a link on the individual page to the source directly.
Correct, and that is the it's the SDK reference search plugin. It's written by Nurik.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
One of the developer designers on the Android team.
Oh, okay, cool.
And you're absolutely right. He's done a really great job, I think, of keeping it up to date as well. Because one of as someone who looks at the platform internals a lot, one of the things that has sort of baned me from version to version is that they tend to reorganize the structure of the code a lot in AOSP. So the same thing likes to move into different places of the code, just not always in the same place. And he's done a really good job of keeping that up to date, so that even though parts of the framework are getting spread apart all over the place, those links still work.
Oh,
so
awesome.
yeah, I use that tool every single day.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, it's so helpful. Just like it's right there. I think sometimes, like, I've used it for so long, I forgot that it was a plugin, and then I kept telling people, oh yeah, just click on the view source link, and they're like, what view source link?
There's another really great one also that I use a ton. It's a little bit more geared towards actually diving into the source code.
Oh really?
But there's a website out there who is maintained by an engineer who actually works at Intel called the AndroidXRef. AndroidXRef.com.
Okay.
It's a cross-reference search of the entire source code.
Nice.
So while the plugin is nice because you can be looking at the documentation, you'll see a link and it'll take you into the source for that page. It's not as easy on Google's GitWeb to sort of navigate between different pages. And if you're looking at a class definition, can you jump to where that's actually defined?
It's just like the raw text of the file. So.
AndroidXRef it is based off of OpenGrok, which is basically a search engine that does all that cross-linking for you. So you can search through the Android code, and then from there you can easily sort of jump in between different files and jump to the implementation of this method or that field.
Nice.
And it's a really great tool to use as well if you want to kind of go beyond just looking at the veneer surface of the framework and really start looking more deeply into the source code.
So you can see connections and navigate to actually like things that are kind of interrelated and going from here to there.
And it has a really powerful search engine that you don't necessarily get with the other tool.
So speaking of changes, I feel like, obviously like every year we have like a new version of Android, and we've got new things coming out. Like just recently with Marshmallow, we've got a whole new like permission system, and I feel like it's always like, obviously as like engineers and as software developers, one of the biggest parts of our job is trying to keep up and kind of learn the new things. So in general, again, as like the expert, what are some good tips that you can give to folks where, okay, so something you just got announced, something big has changed. What's like the best way for me to approach, I guess, learning about it and maybe kind of making sure that I stay ahead of it? And what are some things that, when a new SDK comes along, what are some things that are really important for me to kind of keep in mind?
That's a good question. I guess as far as staying up to date on the new stuff, I think, again, I'm going to go back to the fact that I think Google has done a really good job of providing that information if you know where to find it. I think that the documentation, they do a really good job of telling you what's new, the highlights in the new APIs, and giving you good descriptions about, okay, if you look at the old version versus the new version, this is what has changed. And I think the thing that they've done really well recently that maybe they haven't been doing several years ago is that they've really started to push a lot of resources out through their YouTube channel. We used to maybe get a dev bite or something like that, maybe one or two with each platform release or something like that. Now these things are coming constantly. On app development techniques, performance, and just what's new in the latest APIs. So I think if people aren't already familiar with the fact that Google Developers has a YouTube channel and that there's a section of that dedicated to Android development, they're pushing out a ton of content there, whether it's tips and tricks on the latest stuff that they've just announced in the support library or in the platform, or whether it's release notes of a new announcement, like Google Play Services just got updated not too long ago. Here's all the stuff we changed, allowing people to consume that in maybe in a more friendly way than having to actually read through a bunch of release notes, which again, they've also done a great job of providing that as well. Yeah,
and most of the videos are pretty consumable. They're like maybe just a few minutes, so it's not something like really intimidating, like you're going to have to set aside an hour to watch a long video. They're really snappy. They kind of touch on all the salient points, and then obviously like they have like all the good links to the even longer documentation. But yeah, that's actually is a really good resource.
And they're pretty entertaining too.
Yeah, they are. They're good.
I mean, they're not too difficult to watch. I think a lot of the guys on the Google team are really good on camera, which is not always true of software developers.
That is really, we're pretty lucky in that, in that regard, I guess. So you're actually giving a training session really soon, right, on testing?
That's correct.
Cool. So can you kind of give us a little more information on, I guess, in terms of like, I guess one venue of teaching yourself Android or any other technical skill? Can you talk about like your what kind of training you do, like with New Circle, and what's all that about, and what it's like, and maybe kind of like who's it for?
Sure. So we try to have offerings for developers at every level. You know, our biggest courses are things like Android Bootcamp, which is geared towards not necessarily someone who has no programming experience, but has no experience with the Android platform. So maybe they understand a little bit about how software development works. They've written code in some other language, but they're interested in Android. They don't really know anything about mobile development, and they want to get started. Now, the majority of our courseware, at least up till now, has been taught in the classroom. So I personally believe very strongly that one of the best ways for me to teach you how to do something is for you and me to be in the same room.
That makes
Right.
sense, yeah.
I mean, you know, I mentioned that a lot of it is hands-on coding, but and that's something that I could probably give you, you know, here's a bunch of exercises to go off and do on your own. But when something goes wrong, having me or another instructor in the room to be able to address those issues, or just tangential questions. You know, what after you do that, an idea pops in your head, well, what if we did this, or what happens if I do this? And being able to have that conversation is so much more effective in learning than trying to do that long distance. So a lot of our stuff is still done in the classroom whenever possible. And so boot camp is a 5-day course we teach in the classroom. We have Android Internals course, which is another huge course of ours that is more geared towards teaching developers how the Android platform works. So beyond the application layer, because Android's open source and we can look at this stuff, how is it put together? How does it work on the inside? If you wanted to build your own version of it, how would that look? You know, what do you do to make changes and stuff like that? So, you know, OEMs and system integrators are interested in that sort of thing. But personally, I think all Android developers, when they get to a certain level, should be interested in that sort of thing. You know, if you really want to become an expert at Android, learn how the platform is built, learn how it works inside. So that's a great course for advanced developers as well as people who are actually working on the platform side of things.
Right. So to kind of go back to touch back on what you talked about previously, and is actually something that I'm really interested in, is the Android kind of startup in the Android internals. And I kind of wondered if there was like kind of one of your favorite parts or your favorite, I guess, pieces of like that internal architecture that you feel like people, like the developers, should learn, like of anything. What's like your number one favorite thing to tell people to learn about in terms of Android internals?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the framework, just from an architectural perspective, and just learning some of those pieces that would otherwise be hidden from you. There's some really neat patterns going on in there. At least I think they're neat. But I guess if I were to pick one that developers would be interested in, I'd have to go with LowMemoryKiller, probably. It's an interesting one because pretty much every developer at one point or another has interacted with it, whether they knew it or not. You know, it's one of those things where the actions of developers can influence what LowMemoryKiller does, and I don't think necessarily developers always recognize that. You know, just learning about how LowMemoryKiller works, what does it even do, first of all, you know, and then understanding how Android tracks processes that are in the foreground and the background, and there's like 8 or 9 different background states, and they all mean different things depending on what your application is doing, and LowMemoryKiller treats them differently because of that. So sort of learning what that behavior is like, and then understanding that sort of associated with how much memory your application is using is what governs whether you get to stay alive or not. And so while as developers we're not necessarily supposed to be paying direct attention to whether our application is live or dead. At the same time, anything we can do to keep our app in memory as long as possible is going to provide a better experience for the user at the end of the day. So recognizing what those things are, what those rules are, will, I think, make every application developer just that much better by recognizing just that part of the system that they're working within.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, like as a developer, that's a really interesting way to kind of balance out writing code that's beautiful and well architected and is really nice from like a very idealistic standpoint, but then having to actually understand kind of like the nitty-gritty of what's going on underneath to make the application itself, you know, run beautifully and become a good user experience. Like it's a really interesting kind of balance between the idealistic and the actual like hard work, practical side of things, like when you're writing your code. So I think that's a really good advice. I
think it's an interesting case study too, just looking through the framework, because you realize that a lot of the framework code is not pretty code, and it's because above all else, they're writing code that has to be performant. When you're writing low-level system code, you have to pay very close attention to, how much memory are you using, and all those little things that application developers don't always pay as much attention to maybe as they should. And so sometimes it can be difficult code to read because it's not real progressive in terms of feature, because there's a lot of code in there that's just managing memory and making sure that things are fast and performant and clean. And that doesn't always translate well to human readability, unfortunately.
Oh, that's right. So code doesn't lie, and sometimes it doesn't look pretty either. So that's 2 good lessons to take today. So I want to wrap up by asking you, because I could probably ask you like a million different questions on how to make my Android development better. But what are your this is kind of be a weirdly worded question, but your favorite pet peeves, like things that you really, really would like people not to do in Android?
Sure. Okay. I can think of a couple things. The first is not so much something you shouldn't do, but it's something you should learn, which is everybody who's been an application developer for any length of time has dealt with the context object at some point in their lives. Everything in Android is a context, and everything else basically requires a context. But not all contexts are created equal. They're not all the same. And a couple of years ago, I actually wrote an article on this, sort of explaining that a little bit, because people just assume that every context that was available to you had the same capabilities, and that's not necessarily true. It turns out every single one of those different contexts you have, activity, service, application, and all those others, they have different capabilities, and you can't always use one where the other is necessary. So just understanding that subtle distinction and recognizing what those capabilities are can go a long way, partially just understanding how the system works, but also to keep you from getting into a bind and trying to use something out of context.
So don't just get application context and call it a day.
Right, right. There are things that context cannot do that you need it to do in some cases.
Okay.
The other really popular one that I've been tooting for a while has to do with layout inflation. Layout inflators there's a number of different versions that take different parameters, but almost all of those implementations require a parent view in one form or another. And it happens to be a parameter that a lot of people tend to ignore. They just assume that because it works without it, it works just fine. You can pass null, and it doesn't matter. In some cases, maybe I don't even have access to that view, and so rather than trying to go find it, it's easier just to pass null. And most of the time it works, so people just assume that that's the right thing to do. The difficulty with that is what's actually going on in there and why that parameter is necessary can bite you somewhere down the road that you weren't necessarily expecting. It has to do with the way that Android views and their layout parameters work. When you're building a view in XML or really in Java code, you declare the behavior of how that view should look in its layout or in its parent using these layout params. And those are all the layout underscore attributes in XML or the layout params in Java. Each of those things are designed to declare how that view should be represented in its parent. And so in order to determine how those things should be used or how they should be created, Android has to have a reference to the parent, because it has to be able to define that relationship, and depending on what the parent is, those things aren't going to be the same.
Right.
So by passing null, what effectively happens in a layout inflation is that those layout parameters that live at the top level get erased. They just disappear. And in a lot of cases, that may not matter. So this is one of those things that people don't necessarily notice right away, because the first time they try it, with or without default layout parameters, ends up with the same result.
Right.
But at some point, you're going to try to define that view to have a fixed height or something like that, and you're going to do that using a layout parameter, assuming that it's going to be mapped up to the list view or whatever you're binding these elements into, and those things are just going to flat out disappear, and your view is going to be squashed down wrap content or something like that, and you're going to have no idea why. Well, it's in the XML file, and every other time I did this, it worked. So really, it just boils down to anytime you see a layout inflator API, it always gives you the parent view in whatever the context is, whether it's list view or a fragment or whatever the case is. There's a parent view there. You just may not have known why they gave it to you. Well, it's because you need it for the inflator. So because it's given to you, just pass it along. It's not a whole lot of extra work. I wrote an article on this as well, and there are cases where it may make sense to use null. And I go into those there. So it's not like this is an all or nothing thing, but the general rule should be find the view and use it, not assume I don't need it.
Gotcha. Cool.
The other one that I've noticed more recently has to do with framework callbacks. Developers, not incorrectly, assume that anytime you get a callback from the framework, whether that's a lifecycle method or something from one of the APIs you're working with, the assumption is that those callbacks happen on the main thread. And I think that's valid. They probably should assume that because they're told as much when it comes to the lifecycle.
Right.
However, there are a number of framework APIs, especially some of the more recent APIs, some of them in Google Play Services, as well as the others associated with Bluetooth and some of the other new APIs. Those callbacks don't happen on the main thread. They're actually, there's some internal implementation details here, but they're actually triggered on thread pools, which means not only is it not the main thread, but you have no clue what thread it actually is.
Right.
And different callbacks may come back on different threads. So while personally I think the framework probably should have managed that for us, they don't in a lot of cases, and it seems like the number of cases are showing up more and more frequently. So from a developer's perspective, again, this is more of a do than a don't do. Validate the assumption that your callbacks are coming back on the main thread. You know, use the APIs that are available to check what thread am I on when you're using something new, so that you know if you can do things like touch the UI, or whether you have to go through the work of synchronizing those results back to your own thread or the main thread or something like that. Just validate those assumptions ahead of time.
And concurrency matters.
And concurrency matters.
Hashtag. All right. So, well, thanks so much, Dave. I think that's a really great note to end on. So, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter. My hashtag, or my handle is devunwired. DEVUNWIRED.
Gotcha.
That's what I am on most of the social things. So you can follow me on GitHub at devunwired as well, and anything else. The only place that's different is Google Plus. Google Plus, I'm Dave Smith Dev. Because apparently Dave Smith was taken. So, oh well.
Surprise.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, everything else is pretty much devunwired across the board.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Of course,
Dave.
I appreciate it.
Awesome. And if you're in the Denver area, definitely go to a meetup and check out one of Dave's talks because he's always talking at meetups and he's a great speaker.
Thank you.
But great. Thanks so much, Dave, and thanks so much, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.